We're ready to get started.
Thank you very much. If there's been one thing in my life in the church that I have been passionate about, it has been the full incorporation of children and youth into the life of the congregation. And it happens that there's a compelling body of longitudinal research on how we develop a mature, lifelong faith that has inspired me to write both of my books. So I want to talk first a little bit about the implications of the research in lifelong faith formation in churches and congregations, and how we become intentionally intergenerational in worship, in education, in service, and in fellowship. In 2014, I heard sociologist Christian Smith deliver the Ensign Lecture at Yale Divinity School, and what he said in about 45 minutes struck me hard. He was reporting from the conclusions drawn from the fourth wave of data in the National Study of Youth and Religion, which is a longitudinal study of more than 3,000 youth that began in 2001. He said unequivocally that the single greatest influence on the spiritual and religious lives of American teenagers is their parents, not clergy, not youth ministers, that home is where faith is passed on, not church, not camp, not mission trips. And the means of transmission is ordinary life practices, not preaching, not programs, not rites of passage. Nothing else, he said, becomes remotely close to matching the influence of parents on religious faith and the practices of youth. The statistics were really startling. 82% of children whose parents were active in their congregations, who practiced their faith and who talked about matters of faith at home, were religiously active as young adults. Only 1% of older teenagers whose parents placed little emphasis on religion were religiously active as young adults. Now, it happens that I heard him speak 2 weeks ago. And of course, as I said, this study began in 2001. His work now is with parents and finding out, what characteristics of parents have led to these kids growing into their lifelong faith. But he was speaking to a group of religious educators and clergy. And when we asked him, just to cut to the chase, what should we be doing in our churches, especially post-COVID, now that it doesn't really, we have this opportunity to do things differently, what should we be doing? He said, if it's not relational, don't do it. It's not going to build the kingdom. It's not going to create disciples. It's not going to pass on the faith or strengthen the faith, even of adults. If it's not relational, don't do it. That was fascinating to me. But I wanted to return a little bit to his earlier research, because the problem of declaring that parents are their children's primary pastors is obvious to those of us who work in the church. Influential cultural scripts disempower parents, Smith says, by telling them to turn their children over to experts, us. Many religious parents operate on the model that someone else is responsible for forming their children religiously. Our job is not to be the experts. Our job is to encourage parents to accept and embrace this role as their children's primary pastors, and to give them the vocabulary they need to articulate their faith. What if we thought about our work as helping to create opportunities for faith to be lived and shared among people of all ages, not only at church, but at home and out in the world? What Smith and his collaborator, Melinda Denton, quickly noticed when they began their research is that American teenagers are incredibly inarticulate about their faith, their religious beliefs and practices, and its meaning or place in their lives. And I think it's possible that the adults around them struggle with this too. Religious language is a foreign language for many people. And in order to become fluent in it, we first need to hear people in community that we're in relationship with talk about God, talk about what we believe, and talk about why it matters. I think for many of us, what we are trying to articulate to our children might be drastically different from the understanding of God that we grew up with. For many people, their thoughts and their beliefs aren't what's commonly accepted in popular culture or even in their extended families. and they need our help. And I don't mean just the help of the clergy and the lay staff or the Sunday school teachers. In fact, we know that participation in Sunday school and youth group are not indicators of kids and teens who become faithful adults. What matters most, according to research by the Fuller Youth Institute, the Search Institute, and others, is participation in worship and connection to other adults in the faith community. Now, the great news is that we already have worship and other adults in our faith communities. But what that means in practical terms is that if we're going to effectively support parents and actively engage kids of all ages and connect them to other adults, other members of the faith community, we probably have to change some things. Now, one of the things that has driven me crazy for many years, in fact, someone tried to use it in introducing me to a congregation that where I was going to work now, so probably about 13 years ago now. They quoted me saying something I would never in a million years say: children are the future of the church. And I had to write back and say, that's absolutely not true. Children are the church right now. And without them, we are incomplete. Church is one of the few places in contemporary society where we intentionally bring together all ages. Most churches, however, are multi-generational, not intergenerational, with age segregation a feature of worship, of education, of Bible study, of small groups, of service opportunities, and even fellowship. Now, I grew up in an intergenerational church, one that took my gifts as a child and as a teenager seriously enough to use them every week. I started working in the church nursery when I was 10. I earned 50 cents an hour. At 14, I was teaching Sunday school, and I was the youngest member of the Christian Education Committee, which met on Sunday afternoons so that I could attend. I also sang in the choir. When I was a freshman in high school, my parents separated, and for a period of a few months, my mother, in her pain, stopped going to church. I got on the bus and went by myself because I was pretty well convinced they couldn't have church without me. I wonder what it would be like if all our children felt like that. There's a new book which I commend to you, edited by Corey Seibel, called The Generative Church: Global Conversations About Investing in Emerging Generations. One of the chapters is by Joseph Azzopardi and Cale DeWall, who are presently working in Australia, and it outlines 5 factors found in intergenerational communities: positive interactions, connectedness, interdependence, empowerment, and accommodation. The first 3 factors, positive interactions, connectedness, and interdependence, they're careful to point out, are key to building healthy communities of any kind. But the last 2, empowerment and accommodation, concern, this is a quote, concern inclusivity, which is an essential characteristic of Christian community. I thought that was really, really compelling. At the heart of their work is the idea that intergenerationality creates the ideal context for discipleship. And that's what we're really about, isn't it? We want to create disciples. We're learning to follow Jesus. And it's a lifelong process for all of us. There's a classic book on curriculum in the church by Catholic theologian Maria Harris called Fashion Me a People, which explores how the church has traditionally carried out service to God through community, prayer, worship, teaching, proclamation, and service. We come to church because of our, I got ahead of myself. So each of these things, community, prayer, worship, teaching, proclamation, service, is a course of study, a way we learn about the church, about God, and about each other. We come to church because of our deep desire for belonging and connection. And here we find, according to Harris, that the Word of God is addressing us, saying something to us, making demands on us, and asking us to live that word in our lives. So that got me thinking, what does that word look like? I have a lot of photographs to show you of intergenerational church in action. So I'm going to share my screen. And now I want to tell you a little bit about my context, where I'm coming from. This is St. Paul's Chapel in Lower Manhattan. It was built in 1766. Until the pandemic, it was the oldest building in continuous use in Manhattan. And you can see that it's right across the street from the Freedom Tower, which means that it was right across the street from the World Trade Center. Mm-hmm. So this was my context for 5 years for as the person responsible for children, youth, and family for faith formation and education. So most of the slides I'll be showing you are from this particular church. Trinity is unusual for lots of reasons, not the least of which it's where Alexander Hamilton is buried. Trinity is, of course, the mother church, which is 5 blocks closer to the water. St. Paul's was built as a chapel of ease. In those days, the roads weren't paved and people didn't want to walk all the way down to Trinity in the mud in the wintertime. So they went to St. Paul's Chapel. When Trinity burned down in the Great Fire of 1776, St. Paul's stood because there weren't any other buildings around it. It was saved by a bucket brigade, and we actually found a leather bucket when we were doing some remodeling that was from that time period. It also withstood the destruction of the World Trade Center, and for 9 months, from 2001 in October to May of 2002, it was the center for rescue and recovery workers. It was staffed 24 hours a day entirely by volunteers. I was privileged to be a volunteer there twice for a 12-hour shift overnight in those days, long before I dreamed of working at Trinity Church. It was also one of the first places I visited when I moved to New York City. If you've seen the movie Into the Spider-Verse, however, St. Paul's Chapel and Trinity Church feature in that. Trinity is where Peter Parker, Spider-Man, is buried. It also turns up, the spire of Trinity Church turns up in some of the video games as well. So even our younger kids have a strong connection. When we first started talking about intergenerational relationships at Trinity, we started gently, and we started with periodic community building, relationship building activities. And this is a Sunday after church in Trinity, or rather in St. Paul's churchyard. And we are making cards for pastoral care to use to send to shut-ins and to people having birthdays, and to whatever occasion one might send a card. But as you can see, it attracted a large group of all ages who sat and painted together and visited. And we started doing that once every season, using different art techniques. This is liquid watercolors. First, we really wanted people to be comfortable with each other. Now, we have a feeding program at St. Paul's where mostly people from Chinatown come. For now, they're able to come breakfast, lunch, and dinner and pick up food. Originally, we were serving lunch and then breakfast as well, but we've been able to expand and needed to expand in the pandemic. It isn't something that children aren't necessarily present for, but it's important for them to know that it's been going on, that it's something that we think is important, and want to make sure they know that it's part of our job to make sure hungry people are fed. This is a day of service at St. Paul's on Martin Luther King Day. And we're making bean soup in a jar with a recipe and the ingredients that are all going into this brown paper bag. A lot of our clients, a lot of our guests are people who are food insecure and not homeless. So they have kitchens and they're able to take home groceries, and they are able to cook, but their money runs out at the end of the month and they just don't have enough to share. So one of the things that we did intergenerationally is, in the midst of this activity, we began with an activity because that's a great starting point to gather people as they're when they might be leaving church, but instead, to bring them together to say, would you come help us make some bean soup? And after they've been active for a while, we gave them the opportunity to break into groups, and we asked them to find people of different generations to gather with. And we asked someone in each group to grab a larger bag that had been stapled shut. And when they opened their bags, they found varying amounts of food in it. So some people, one group had a bag that was filled with pretzels and cheese sticks and goldfish crackers, and another person had a bag that was had sliced apples in individual packets. And some people had almost nothing in their bag to share with their group. And it didn't take very long for people to look around and realize that the only way that everyone who'd been assembled to help with this project was going to have a snack was if they shared. And of course, it was the children who pointed that out. So that got us talking about food insecurity in Manhattan, and we had some facts and figures for them to discuss. It was a very eye-opening event for the adults as well as the children, but this particular opportunity went side by side with an event the day before where youth and adults were invited to take part in a poverty simulation. It was one that was done very carefully because a lot of the people who participated are people who were in situations that varied widely. So when you have a large group of people from different socioeconomic groups, as we do at St. Paul's every Sunday, that's a sensitive subject, but it's important for everyone to feel that they can be a part of that conversation and a part of solving the problems around world hunger, neighborhood hunger, and how the church gets involved. Now, we had lots of opportunities to think seasonally about how to come together intergenerationally. And what had been a very fun adult evening of Mardi Gras became something that we wanted the kids to be able to participate in too. It meant that we no longer serve alcohol on Mardi Gras. That was a decision that our bishop helped us make. That was a policy that went into effect throughout the Diocese of New York. But it didn't actually change the merriment, the festivities of Mardi Gras. It did change the order of events, however. We're burning palms from Palm Sunday the year before for Ash Wednesday, the day after Mardi Gras. And we moved that from the end of the evening to the beginning of the evening, before dinner is served and before the music and dancing began, so that the kids could take part in it. There's something very attractive about fire and kids. However, we've been able to do this very safely for quite a while now. This is Palm Sunday, and lots of people are very surprised to see a donkey walking from, leading a procession from St. Paul's Chapel to Trinity Church, 5 blocks away on Broadway. It's a wonderful act of public witness. It's really one of those things that people stop for, and for many people, it's a light bulb moment. Oh, I know what day this is. And everyone hands out palms, and everyone is invited into the church to participate in the Palm Sunday service. But the donkey is, of course, what makes it, I think, a particularly startling event in New York City. Even when children aren't present, and this is Trinity Church during the pandemic, their presence is known and valued. You can see the Alleluia banners that the children decorated on our Mardi Gras party, that when we said goodbye to the Alleluia, which we don't say in the Episcopal Church during Lent, these banners were rolled up and put in a safe place and brought out on Easter Sunday. And of course, these banners in particular were made just before the pandemic, before we realized we wouldn't be in church together at Easter, but they were present for all 50 days of Easter. So even without physically being in the building or participating in this much more formal liturgy than the children had been attending, they could look at this and know that they were valued. Now, we do a very traditional Christmas pageant on the fourth Sunday of Advent, and lots of little angels and magi, and there's even a camel, are in this wonderful service. It takes the place of the liturgy of the word, the sermon, and the scripture reading for that day. But we also have a Christmas Eve service that we didn't want to repeat the pageant. It's too stressful for so many to participate in a Christmas pageant on Christmas Eve. However, I think too that when the Christmas story is only told by very young children, the unspoken message is that the Christmas story is only for very young children. So we wanted to try something different. And so we commissioned these puppets to help us tell the Christmas story. And they are large enough that they can only be used, manipulated, worn by adults and teenagers. So you're seeing Mary and Joseph here, and we have 14 puppets. Some of them are on poles and can be carried. The angels are on poles, the star, the camel, the animals are on poles. Actually, they're lambs that are headpieces and hooves. But the shepherds, Mary and Joseph, and the Magi are these giant 10 to 12 foot puppets. This was a labor of love, but it is something that is really, really breathtaking and an incredible way to get our teenagers and adults involved in telling the story. Now, not all services invite the participation of young children, but there are services, even in a formal setting, that can involve the participation of children. This is my son, Peter, when he was at St. Bart's, where he was a chorister in Midtown Manhattan. He's reading the traditional chorister's lesson from the service of Lessons and Carols. It's the first lesson. It is the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And it's always in our tradition, in the Anglican tradition, read from the King James Bible. So it's quite lengthy and wordy, but he practiced, and that happens to be a particular gift of his. He was 8 here, almost 9. And this, of course, was a decade ago. He's now in college. But he did such a good job reading that he became the first person under the age of, 60 to read a lesson at our Easter Vigil, which is on the night before Easter, always at night. And it was an expansive experience for a lot of the adults who really treasure being able to read and participate in that service. But now even St. Bart's has a tradition of choosing readers of various ages to participate throughout the services. Intergenerational retreats have, as I talked about earlier, have been something that has also been an easy way in. If you are a community that already does retreats, it is a wonderful way of building relationships because you have a time apart and you're in a place apart, and so you're willing sometimes to try out activities and start making relationships with people that you might not otherwise have reason to interact with. This is a traditional Columbus Day retreat that our seniors group has done. This year, because of the pandemic, they were able to have the retreat in person, but it was not able to be intergenerational because children, of course, aren't vaccinated yet. So this is from a few years ago, where they very graciously, the seniors agreed to share the house with families. We discovered that the holiday weekends were really the best weekends for families to go away on retreat. And sometimes there's room for everyone. So this is what worship looks like at Trinity Retreat Center at an intergenerational retreat. We're too big for the chapel. So we're outdoors in warm weather, and there's a building that's large enough for us in colder weather. But it is really wonderful to have everyone gathered around the table. Some of our most popular intergenerational retreats I first imagined as family retreats, but in fact, grandparents came with grandchildren to our Harry Potter retreat. And I don't know if you can see the owl that she's holding. So we did a Narnia retreat, which also brought in a lot of people who wanted to explore the story, not just children. And having a story that engages the imagination and makes connections very directly to stories of our faith is just a really wonderful way to get adults and kids talking about the through lines and the themes and the connections to our lives. Now, here we are inside St. Paul's Chapel. You saw beautiful Trinity Church with the Alleluia banners. St. Paul's is a very different environment, and Trinity is very fortunate to have both worship spaces. Because the pews were so badly damaged from the men's boots after so many months of sleeping in the pews, they were not repaired. They were removed and they were replaced with chairs, which gave us a very flexible space for worship. And in 2014, in the fall of 2014, a family service began. And it was originally imagined that it would be a family service, that it would be a service widely attended by families with young children. And by summer of 2015, when I started there, it was very clearly an intergenerational service with adults attending specifically to be in a group that radiated joy. It's also, I should point out, a 45-minute service, and there was a fantasy by some adults and some staff that people would graduate from this service and go to the formal 11:15 liturgy at Trinity Church. And I will tell you that that did not happen. And by the time I left in March of 2020, the service had grown to 250 people on a Sunday morning, primarily from word of mouth. A lot of people came within walking distance. There were some people who came to both services, both the 9:15 and the 11:15 at Trinity Church. It has a very specific orientation to include children, but it is not a children's service. Now children are involved in many ways, and here you can see that these are the children who've collected the offering and who will bring it forward to the altar. We found that having baskets that were both light and deep so that you didn't have to worry about what was going to spill out was really helpful. And everyone before COVID was invited to stand around the altar for the Eucharistic prayer. Communion is something Episcopal churches do every week. And so this is a shot of Kristen Miles, who even shares the chalice and the cruet with children who are standing around the altar. You can see that one young man is holding on to the candle. He is in fact a candle guard, because there are some younger children who might topple that. My boss assured me that would only happen once, that a child would get hot wax spilled on them, but I couldn't quite bear letting that happen. So we appointed candle guards, which was a very coveted responsibility. And of course, the children helped not only set up the space, but returned it to the next iteration. This is the carpet where children at this service were invited to sit for the sermon. They also danced during the songs, but for a period of about 18 months, the space was shared with the congregation at Trinity Church while their space was being remodeled. So in order to set up the chairs to accommodate them, the carpet gets rolled and put away. But everyone has a hand in participating. Now, as I mentioned, the congregations of both the 915 and the 1115, which had been separated by 5 blocks and didn't really know each other, had the opportunity to interact in that time when both were worshiping in the same space. And at this time, Trinity had not opened its new building for program space. We were renting space across the street at the New York County Lawyers Association, which is why you see all these white men in suits on oil paintings hanging in the background. We decided that this gave us a unique opportunity to try intergenerational education. And it wasn't something that we did every week, although everyone came to the New York County Lawyers Association for education, whether they were meeting in age groups or intergenerationally. Every 4 to 6 weeks for these 18 months, we did bring all ages together in education. We also made sure that we were addressing the same themes throughout. We had a theme for the entire year and a theme for each season of the church year. And everyone had that point of connection, so that even when we weren't doing an activity together, we had ways of talking about what we were doing. We knew that we were hearing the same stories. We were connecting to the same themes. So this was an example of one of our intergenerational gatherings where there were tables set up around the room and activities that were hosted by various people, volunteers. This is a couple of the young adults who are hosting at this table for an activity. Our first year, the theme was Jesus, Rebel with a Cause. And during Lent, we did spiritual practices and called it Still Rebel Jesus. And one of our spiritual practices was yoga. And you can see that our older adults are doing chair yoga, and the children are on the yoga mats, and there are some young adults on yoga mats, which are just out of view. But that was a really great way that we could be doing the same activity at our various levels. And this was something we carried over to the retreats and to classes as well, the yoga. We also decided we had the opportunity to share with the adults some of the educational opportunities that the children loved so much. And this is godly play. which is a Montessori-based program of Christian formation. It usually involves small objects that are beautiful and very well made. But when we did it for the entire congregation, we did godly play large. And so we are using the actual items in the actual church to tell the story of holy baptism. You can see the font. You can see our very large dove kite, which we usually use at Pentecost. You can see the Paschal candle, which in Episcopal churches is lit for every baptism and every funeral. And the children are standing around a table that is used at Compline to hold candles, because part of the godly play baptism story means that every child is handed a candle in memory of their baptism or in anticipation of their baptism. And what you can't see out of the shot here is that there are at least 20 adults and probably 10 teenagers standing in concentric arcs behind them with their candles, which everyone wanted a candle. We had, at this point, St. Paul's was open to visitors, and even visitors came in and asked for a candle to participate in this story. Our intergenerational activities extended to pilgrimages. And we decided that we were going to start focusing on pilgrimages rather than mission trips. Trinity had a long history of mission trips and long relationships of mission, but we decided that we wanted to refocus on relationship, and that included the people who we were going to be with on these pilgrimages. We were invited to Standing Rock right after the Water Protectors movement, because we had been involved with helping supply them with very practical needs from a distance. And so in August that year, let me see what if I can I even tell you what year it is? I think it's 2017. We took a group of 30 pilgrims ranging in age from 6 to 60. We were invited to come to the powwow and spend several days learning about the Water Protectors movement and the history of the Lakota people. And we weren't there to do, we were there to listen and learn. So you're seeing our group as in addition to our friends that we made at Standing Rock. We did a lot of intentional preparation in advance of this. For the 6-year-old, that meant we had picture books about Lakota traditions and the Water Protectors movement. For the youth and the adults, it was much more intentional. It included a lot of reading and a lot of interaction and a lot of work exploring our biases and our knowledge of history and the big pieces that we were missing, so that we were prepared to go and learn more. In the summer of 2019, we did a racial justice pilgrimage, and the youngest in that group, those were just teenagers and adults. The adults range quite a bit in age. We imagined that it would be a group that would be primarily white, but in fact, our racial justice committee really wanted to be a part of this, and so it was a very mixed group. We had a number of our Black elders who were in the group, as well as a lot of white teenagers and several Black young adults who were not African American. They were African born or born in Europe, and so didn't have the history of the civil rights movement in the US, which this focused on, and where it led us today. So that trip was primarily Atlanta, and then several sites in Alabama. And again, with very, very rigorous preparation. And one of the big learnings on that trip was that the kids really needed to do some processing away from the adults. It was appropriate to bring them together at certain times. It was appropriate to do events together, but particularly because the kids had questions they didn't want to be embarrassed to ask, and because the trip brought up big emotions, it was clear to us that not everything could be intergenerational. Some things just absolutely needed to be separate. And the adults needed to give the kids plenty of space and not pressure them and ask questions. And that was a big learning for the adults as well. One really wonderful thing that happened was that we had an environmental justice committee who every year invited all ages to participate in the Riverkeeper Sweep, which I think is done nationally by the Riverkeepers organization. This is, of course, the Hudson River, and it involves a full morning of cleanup. And after a couple of years of doing this, the teenagers decided that they'd like to get more involved with the Environmental Justice Committee. And they planned with the Environmental Justice Committee 3 field trips in New York City to find out more about environmental activism in the city. And what that led to the next year was this. Our teenagers were instrumental in a citywide climate change march. And they decided that St. Paul's really needed to be the place where everyone could gather on the day of the march, including our local high school. We've had a really strong relationship with the local high school. Two of our youth were leading the march at a citywide level. And so they were able to teach the adults where this movement was coming from, introduce them to young activists, and say, listen, we want to be able to gather here. We want to invite our friends. We want them to know it's safe space. So we don't want to pray. We want to make sure that our Muslim friends and our Jewish friends and our absolutely not Christian friends know that this is a place too for them. So can we do this? Is this okay? And, the leadership said, yes, absolutely. The church is can be this too. And as you can see, this was an amazing gathering. You can see Matt Welsh standing at the very back, our priest for youth and family. He's wearing his clerical collar. He did a prayer very specifically for a small group who asked for it, but they honored the kids' request to make this a place for all people. And this was, of course, one of the last gatherings pre-pandemic, before everything changed. But we do definitely have an opportunity to go to do things differently, to not go back to the way things have always been. I think it's important for you to hear that Sunday school is in fact a thing of the past, and for really good reason. It started 100 years before there was public education in this country. And it started in England before there was public education there as well. But it started to teach children who were in factories how to read and write. It was to give them something, a place to go and something to do on the one day that they had off. And it was never meant to be the primary way that we form faith. So it is something I think that a lot of people struggle with letting go of. But as Ryan, as you said at the very beginning, I mean, there's no reason to go back to what wasn't working. And there's a reason Sunday school wasn't working. We were asking too much of it. And we were keeping kids and youth particularly away from the adults who then can pass on their faith in action and in stories and in relationship. So I'm really excited about what you're doing. I'm really excited about what I'm going to be doing in the coming weeks. I'm hoping we can share more as we continue our journeys. But I've been talking for a long time now, and I wonder if you have questions.
Thank you so much, Wendy. I will open it up and leave a little space of silence here as you all think about it. And just feel free to unmute yourself and call out a question.
I've got a question. What kinds of ways do you advertise these intergenerational events and activities? So it's not just families that show up, but it's really everyone.
So I'm really intentional about talking about households rather than families, because everyone can see themselves as part of a household, even if they're a household of one. I think it's important to say what the different opportunities will be at an event that will attract different ages. For instance, we do a St. Francis Day celebration. That's actually a really great way to not only get your church involved, it's a wonderful outreach to the community, because people who don't come to church have pets they want to have blessed. So for that day, which we have not done since the pandemic, but for that day we had a petting zoo, clearly an activity for children that adults also might enjoy. But we invited the mounted police, we invited the K9 unit, we invited the ASPCA, we made cat pulls and dog pulls and cat toys, and raise money that way. We had Habitat for Humanity come. They did a birdhouse build, but they also had a talk to adults to help them get involved with the next Habitat activity. So we posted sort of the menu of opportunities for that day. Included live music, that's a draw for everyone, so that they could see that there'd be something there for them as well. Trinity and another large church where I was had this tradition of doing these really focused adult justice-oriented activities. So Trinity does for many years, 45 years, did an annual theological national and international conference focused on things like racial justice and poverty and the common good, and things, big weighty themes, and invited theologians and the Archbishop of Canterbury. So to find ways for kids and families to connect to that was the challenge there. At All Saints Pasadena, they did a Lent event every year, and one year Helen Prejean came and talked about the death penalty, and I thought, well, how's that going to work with children? But then she decided she wanted to be with the kids after she gave her talk to the adults and tell them about her friends. And we made cards for these people who she told amazing stories about. And, I just had to trust that there would be something for everyone. And there was.